It's the Brian Lehrer Show on WNYC. I'm Amina Serna, a producer for the Brian Lehrer Show, filling in for Brian today, who is off taking care of a family member who's dealing with a health issue. Coming up on today's show, we're going to talk about grocery prices. The high cost of food shopping was a part of Mayor Zohran Mamdani's affordability-themed campaign. He even proposed a pilot of city-owned grocery stores to try to combat the issue. But my guest, urbanist Stephen Smith, wrote about another idea for the journal Vital City that he says will bring prices down, making it easier to build new grocery stores. Plus, for our Health and Climate Tuesdays series, we're going to talk with New York Times global health reporter Apoorva Mandavilli about how the United States may be about to lose its measles-free status. 2025 was the worst year for measles cases here in about 2 decades, and the outbreaks are continuing, right as vaccinations are lagging. And we'll wrap today's show with a question: how cold is it? If you've been outside today, well, you know it's freezing. We'll want to hear your tips, too, on how to stay warm and safe when the high temperature for today is in the low to mid-20s. But first, we begin with President Donald Trump's ongoing attempt and recent escalation to acquire Greenland. Over the weekend, Trump has said the U.S. will impose additional tariffs on 8 European countries until the U.S. has had a deal to acquire Greenland. Trump proposed a 10% tariff starting February 1st, which he says he will raise to 25% in June if Europe doesn't capitulate. Those countries are all members of NATO and have said they stand with NATO member Denmark and its autonomous territory, Greenland. And in multiple social media posts overnight, Trump shared private messages from world leaders, including one from French President Emmanuel Macron that reads, "I do not understand what you're doing on Greenland." President Trump is expected to leave for the World Economic Forum in Davos, Switzerland this afternoon. He's scheduled to speak tomorrow. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent is already in Davos, and today he seemed to issue a warning to European leaders.
The worst thing countries can do is escalate against the United States.
Trump has repeatedly said taking control of Greenland is vital for U.S. national security, frequently citing concerns about Russia and China's Arctic influence. He has suggested purchasing Greenland, which is not for sale, and the White House declared in a statement that using the military to annex Greenland is, quote, always an option. According to a recent YouGov poll, about 3/4 of Americans oppose taking Greenland with military force, with majority opposition across the political spectrum. Joining us now to explain all the latest and what European leaders can do to defend Greenland is Matt Steinglass, Europe editor at The Economist. Matt, welcome to WNYC.
Hi, Amina.
Listeners, anyone out there listening with ties to Greenland, Denmark, or any of the European countries now in the crosshairs of Trump's additional tariff threats, what do you make of European leaders seemingly putting their foot down on Greenland? Long time coming, or are you worried about escalating tensions like a potential trade war? What are you hearing from news media outlets or friends and family back in your country? 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. You can also text that number. And as always, we can take any of your comments or questions on this, whether or not you have ties to Europe. 212-433-WNYC. That's 212-433-9692. All right, Matt, let's start with tariffs. What is the latest that Trump is threatening and why?
The why question is subject to dispute, but the what he is threatening is to raise tariffs from European Union countries to the United States by an additional 10% on top of the 15% that he already imposed back in April. We've done an analysis of what the impact of that would be. Tariffs, of course, make everybody poorer. They will hurt America's economy and Europe's economy. They'll hurt Europe's economy a bit more. Europe exports more to the U.S. than the U.S. exports to Europe. And the analysis we did is sort of back of the envelope. Well, back of the envelope is too unkind to our economists. It's a good analysis, but you have to do some estimates. But it looks like it would cost Europe's GDP about 0.04% of GDP if the U.S. imposed those 10% tariffs on the 8 countries who had sent troops to Greenland. So that is hardly something that's going to drive Europe into recession.
And I'll ask you, pardon, go ahead, finish your thought, please.
Well, the second point, just that Trump says if Europe doesn't respond to his threats, eventually the tariff would go up to 25% over the summer. That would hurt Europe a bit more.
There was so much. I'll ask you a little bit more about your colleagues' reporting on the tariffs and how it will impact European nations and also American consumers. But first, there's been so much news over the weekend. Can you just remind listeners who may have missed it about the European troops in Greenland? Who sent how many over, or broadly, what has been the response?
So the initial deployment was an attempt by NATO countries to respond to what Donald Trump said was his concern over Greenland, which is that there is a mounting security threat in the Arctic, largely from Russia and China. Those concerns are actually somewhat illusory, but responding to that complaint, some European countries sent a few troops. It was a small, symbolic initial deployment of reconnaissance troops mostly. We're talking about, I can't remember the total, but we're talking about perhaps a couple of dozen people at the top, at the outside. That was the initial deployment, and that was what triggered the American response and the threats of tariffs. Since then, Denmark has deployed more troops. Several planes arrived today. The numbers that I've seen are in the hundreds.
Let's go to the European response. Here's UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer on the tariff threat recently.
Alliances endure because they're built on respect and partnership, not pressure. That is why I said the use of tariffs against allies is completely wrong. It is not the right way to resolve differences within an alliance. Nor is it helpful to frame efforts to strengthen Greenland's security as a justification for economic pressure.
So pretty clear pushback on Trump's proposed tariffs from UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer yesterday. Matt, can you tell us more about European leadership's responses?
The threat of tariffs is a bit of a step change for European leaders. I think Europeans who had hesitated to acknowledge how far America's approach to Europe has diverged in this administration from previous ones have now recognized that things have really changed. And it's okay in the way that European diplomats talk about the United States, there's been a real shift. You've seen very strong statements over the last couple of days from previously hesitant leaders like Friedrich Merz of Germany, stating that American threats of tariffs are completely inappropriate. Greenland is part of Danish territory, and that the threat by a NATO ally to take territory from a fellow NATO ally poses very serious risk to the integrity of NATO. And also from European leaders who you might have expected to be more aligned with MAGA, such as Giorgia Meloni in Italy, and the current leader of the Rassemblement National party in France, a very populist nationalist, sort of MAGA but European style party, Jordan Bardella, was adamant that the United States threats towards the territory of a European country weren't acceptable.
EU leaders have threatened to deploy the bloc's anti-coercion instrument. It's being widely referred to in the media as the, quote, big bazooka. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah. So normally, I mean, just to take a step back, the first tariff retaliation that's likely from Europe would be to bring back on the table a package that had been assembled last spring when President Trump initially unveiled tariffs against Europe, which is a retaliatory package of tariffs on $93 billion worth of American exports. And those would be more traditional tariffs on things like whiskey, which might induce European consumers to buy Irish or Scottish whiskey instead of Tennessee whiskey, if they have that option. But the anti-coercion instrument is much broader, and what it does is it allows the European Commission, sort of the executive body of the EU, to look at an entire sector and say the United States is not going to be able to participate in that sector. So it could block American companies from purchases by European governments. It could say, it could designate a sector like, let's say tech, and say American companies in this sector are seen to be exercising inappropriate power, and we're going to hit them with heavy restrictions. And that's a kind of it gives European bureaucrats a freedom to operate in how they would respond to American threats that they don't normally have.
The Economist yesterday reported that Europeans are no longer shocked by the threat of tariffs. A good time to remind listeners that these countries already have tariffs in place, as you mentioned. Can you explain how they see further tariffs as a, quote, nuisance, as you and your colleagues put it?
Yeah, I mean, I think so tariffs that are applied in the way that the current tariffs are outlined, there are a lot of ways to get around them for companies. For example, many European companies have operations in the United States as well. So if you're an auto manufacturer like BMW, let's say, who also has factories in the United States, then you can shift more of your you can shift your sales in the United States more towards production that comes from the United States, and so evade the tariffs more effectively. You can also shift. Interestingly, these tariffs are targeted only at the 8 European countries who had sent troops to Greenland, which means that you could possibly export to the United States via other EU countries that did not send troops to Greenland and evade the tariffs that are being threatened at the moment. There are some sectors in the EU that would be more heavily exposed. Pharmaceuticals, for example, sell a lot to the United States and have relatively few operations in the United States, so it would be harder for them to evade these kinds of tariffs. But one of the effects of instituting tariffs would be to encourage European companies to produce more in the United States and get around the tariffs that way. But the revenues would still flow to the European countries.
Let's go to a caller. Alex in Manhattan, you're on WNYC.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yes, hi.
All right, hi, good morning, and thank you for taking my call. So I've just been looking for an answer for this, and that is, with Trump threatening to take over Greenland, if Denmark is part of NATO, why do we need to threaten this action of taking over Greenland for its own protection? If Denmark is part of NATO, isn't Article 5 then going to be, executed if Russia or China were to do anything on Greenland? Because that seems to be his premise he's saying. And if that's the case, isn't his point mute?
Alex, thank you so much for your call. And Matt, yes, I mean, we've covered this on the show before, but it bears repeating some of the reasons why the U.S. has singled it wants Greenland, some explicitly stated by the president and his cabinet, others put forth by analysis. But let's dig into what Alex is talking about there. Why is Greenland important when it comes to potential missile defense or defending the United States or Greenland itself?
Well, Alex is absolutely right that Article 5 of NATO would protect Greenland already. More than that, the United States has a defense treaty with Denmark signed in 1951 that is extremely broad and allows the United States to deploy an essentially unlimited number of troops to Greenland if it wants to. So if the United States is concerned about a security threat to Greenland, it has the freedom to deploy whatever military assets it wants to in order to protect against that threat. And in fact, Denmark has complained in recent years that the United States has decreased its military presence in Greenland. It's down to a fraction of what it was during the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Greenland is important in certain ways militarily. It's important for monitoring Russian submarine activity in the North Atlantic. It's important, as you mentioned, for missile defense. It's unclear why there would be any threat to those activities. And the threat of the supposed threat of Russian and Chinese intervention appears to be imaginary. No one has noticed an uptick in Russian or Chinese naval operations around Greenland. Russia has its hands full in Ukraine at the moment. It's very unclear what's actually going on here. It seems, from the perspective of most European analysts, this does not seem to be driven by rational security or economic interests. It seems to be driven by either political interests on the part of the Republican Party or by a kind of a personal psychological commitment belonging, it's Donald Trump's own psychological drive.
Mm-hmm. And I'll ask you about the psychological drive in a bit, but here's a text. If the EU retaliates against U.S. tariffs tied to Greenland, what concrete harm would that cause to the U.S. economy? Is that risk being underestimated? Paul from Brooklyn asks, I know you're European editor for The Economist, but your colleagues crunched a couple of those numbers. You mentioned U.S. Pharma would probably be impacted. Do you want to talk a little bit more about the harm to the U.S. economy? I mean, we know, or we've heard analysis on how tariffs impact the consumers more than the people exporting the goods, right?
Yeah. So far, the impact of the tariffs that were already imposed on Europe this spring has fallen almost entirely on American consumers. European companies have not dropped their prices in the U.S. in order to take up some of the impact of the tariffs. The overall impact of the new tariffs, it would be slightly it's slightly lower on the U.S. than on Europe. It's not huge for either country. I think our analysis is that it would decrease America's GDP by about 0.02%. If they go up to 25%, then the impact to the U.S. GDP would be 0.08%. These are not amounts that are going to have a tremendous impact on prosperity.
Let's go to another caller. Deborah in Jersey City. Hi, you're in WNYC.
Hi, good morning to you and your guests. The question nobody seems to be talking about or asking is, Greenland's population is mostly Caucasian, at least from what I can see. And he's always talking about why we can't have immigration from countries like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, which are mostly Caucasian. I think this is another way, which nobody is saying and nobody is asking, for him to get add to the population of the country by with a country that's a territory that's mostly Caucasian, and they're just using national security, because if Greenland is a part of NATO and if someone would attack it and the other NATO countries would come to their defense, his argument for national security makes no sense. And it seems to me this is just another way to add more Caucasian people, because we all know he's a racist and a bigot.
Deborah, thank you so much for your call. And Matt, I do believe that Greenland is a majority indigenous Greenlandic population. I think Deborah's call was kind of going towards maybe the psychological reasons of Donald Trump that you were starting to talk about in an earlier answer. But what would you like to say to Deborah, or making that segue to the psychological sort of the mindset of Donald Trump?
Right. Well, so yeah, we should note first that I think you're right that the majority of Greenland's population is Inuit, although it's a lot of people are mixed Inuit and Danish. Mm-hmm. The second point is that the population of Greenland is tiny. There are about 50,000 people who live there, which is like probably smaller than Red Hook. I don't know. Yeah. So in terms of the population consequences, it's negligible. An interesting to move on to psychology. It's a country that's tiny in terms of population, quite large in terms of landmass. It's not quite as big as it looks on the Mercator projections of the map that you see, but it's still pretty big. It's bigger than the Louisiana Purchase was in the 19th century. Mm-hmm. And psychological boost that Donald Trump might get, or the political boost that he might get from adding a substantial landmass to America's territory, might be playing into his reasoning. And that's sort of speculative. I'm not sure it's actually a good idea to speculate about what his motivations are. Right. But it's certainly not. It's not a very rational calculus. The secondary, the possible rational calculus, which is often advanced, is Greenland is very rich in minerals.
Right.
It's got a lot of rare earths. Those rare earths are largely buried under 1.5 kilometers, about a mile of ice. It's not an easy place to mine. So the economic calculation doesn't seem to make a lot of sense either.
We're getting some calls and texts on the rare earths, the rare earth elements. According to the BBC, China currently dominates the global rare earth supply chain, controlling about 90% of the world's processing and refining. So how does Greenland compare in terms of untapped resources? And is that something that would help the U.S. in Trump's mind get away from depending on China?
In the far future, possibly. Rare earths it's a bit of a misnomer. The elements aren't that rare, right, but they are concentrated very conveniently in some places. And geologists say that the way that they're concentrated in Greenland is somewhat unique and makes them easier to refine. The most expensive part of rare earths is the refining process rather than the mining process usually. So you could imagine that being the case in the distant future. It depends how fast the Arctic melts. It depends. I mean, the mining calculus at the moment has not been there for big mining companies. And that's another interesting aspect of this whole conflict, is that if mining companies wanted to go into Greenland and mine right now, they could get licenses from the Danish government and the Greenlandic government to do so. And they're not banging down anybody's door.
Right. And some more context from CNN. Greenland has over 1,100 identified mineral sites, but there are only 2 active mines and just 8 active licenses for mining. So very hard, as you said, to get to because of that ice sheet. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll get into a couple more of the reasons why the U.S. is going aggressively after acquiring Greenland and what European leaders can do. Stay with us. It's the Brian Lehrer Show. I'm producer Amina Serna, filling in for Brian today. And we're joined by Matt Steinglass, Europe editor at The Economist. Matt, NATO allies have been subject to Trump tariffs, as we've discussed before, and Trump strong-armed several nations into increasing their military spending for NATO. NPR this morning reported that a lot of Trump's moves so far have been accepted by European leadership because of the war in Ukraine. Do you accept that framing, and how is this situation of Greenland different?
Absolutely. That's been extremely important. Ukraine is dependent on American military supplies, less so now than a couple of years ago. Europe has really stepped up. Europe's production of a lot of arms has increased dramatically, and they have taken over possibly the majority of weapon supplies to Ukraine. But for certain key arms, such as Patriot missiles to stop Russian ballistic missiles, and for intelligence as well, America remains crucial. And the arms at this point are being paid for by the Europeans. They're buying them from America, but they're still American-made arms. It would be very detrimental to Ukraine to have those cut off.
What options does Europe have in keeping Greenland out of the hands of the U.S.?
The initial effort to deploy some troops was conceived as a way of making it a bit more complicated, uncomfortable, and difficult for America to take over none of this is phrased this way openly by European governments. European governments say they are responding to America's requests to defend Greenland more strongly. Military analysts will say what they're trying to do is just make it look very awkward for the United States to push them out. If the United States wants to take Greenland militarily, it can. There is no way that Europe can't defend Greenland and wouldn't try. But the European effort is to make that as diplomatically costly as possible to impose some economic costs, and possibly the long run questions will be solved if this ever they'll cross that bridge when they come to it. They could, for example, refuse to recognize American assertions of control. If the U.S. tries to annex Greenland's territory, that might not be recognized internationally.
Greenland, as we've mentioned, is an island of predominantly indigenous people. My colleagues did look this up. The population is approximately 56,000 to 57,000 people, with over 89% being indigenous Greenlandic Inuit, and about 7.5% Danish. In the news recently, there have been some social rifts between Greenlanders and the country of Denmark, of which it is a territory, an autonomous territory. There's been forced contraception of Greenlandic women and the forced removal of Greenlandic children to Denmark via so-called parental competency tests. Given that kind of context and the U.S. now wanting to buy or take over Greenland with military force, what do Greenlanders want? Do they want independence from Denmark? Do they definitely not want to be a part of the U.S.? What are the reports on the ground saying?
You're absolutely right. Greenlanders are generally not tremendously happy with their continued dependence on Denmark. And there's a lot of they view that as a colonial legacy. The polls that I've seen from the past year show that there is a majority support in Greenland for independence. That is a completely different question from whether they would like to be part of the United States rather than Denmark.
Right.
There isn't recent polling on this. The polls are from last year, but those indicated that less than 10% of Greenlanders would support joining the United States. So when Greenland's prime minister says, we choose the European Union, we choose Denmark, if the choice is presented that way, then Greenlanders will probably choose to stay in the EU. But yes, they would prefer to be independent.
A listener texts, Trump's proposed, quote, purchase of Greenland from the unwilling, quote, owner, Denmark, has been reported at U.S. Or $800 to $900 billion U.S. dollars. If the U.S. government can put together this price despite our debt and deficit, we can afford universal health care and support for public broadcasting, cancer research, and the arts. So we've had bases in Greenland since the 1951 treaty. We don't need to buy it. So comment there. I have not seen the price tag reported, but I think a question that goes to the listener's question would be, given the recent escalation in tensions, military threat takeover, is the idea of purchasing Greenland even within the realm of possibility, or have European leaders soured? And actually, more importantly, like, who would the U.S. purchase Greenland from?
Yeah, the only sensible idea would be a promise to Greenlanders. There's not. I don't think people are talking about compensating Denmark somehow. It's not. So Greenlanders have a treaty with Denmark that recognizes their right to hold a referendum on independence if they want to call one. They can decide their own fate. The only sensible idea here would be for the United States to pay citizens of Greenland as a part of a deal to take over the country, and in a way to compensate them for what Denmark spends on them at the moment. It wouldn't cost $800 billion. I'm not sure it's sensible to talk about how much it would cost, right, because it's not on the table. Mm-hmm. But if you offered every Greenlander $1 million, that would be $50 billion. Mm.
Let's go to another caller. Marvin in Brooklyn, you're on WNYC. Hi, Marvin.
Hi, thank you for taking my call, and thank you for doing such a wonderful job sitting in for Brian. I hope members are continuing to contribute. I think there are two items that haven't come up. One is to the extent that we can still be shocked by anything that Donald Trump says or does, that he would end up openly writing to the premier of Norway that I don't have to worry about peace anymore because you didn't give me the Nobel Peace Prize. Even Republicans should be repulsed by this indication of what a lack of morality this person has. And the business about Greenland and alienating all of our closest allies is part and parcel of Trump's 18th century view of the world, which is ruining the American economy and our investments in research, in new technologies, and is making sure that China dominates the 21st century because they're focused on 21st century industries, including renewables, robots, you name it, whatever is new. And Trump is going for oil, is looking to take over other territories, and is leaving the United States without any friends in the world, and is still met by total acceptance by elected Republicans. It's astounding that this is allowed to go on.
Marvin, thank you so much for your call. I'm just going to get a response from our guest for you before you, I know, Matt, you have to go in just a few minutes. Couple of things in Marvin's call there. I mean, first, we didn't even touch the Nobel Peace Prize conversation that happened over the weekend between Trump and, I believe, the leaders of Norway and another Scandinavian country. Could you tell us a little bit about what happened there?
You mean the conversation about in which Trump said that Norway had not awarded him the Nobel Peace Prize, and
That's
that
right.
He might turn away from the idea from supporting peace. Yeah. In Norway, the Norwegian government doesn't determine who gets the Nobel Peace Prize. It's awarded in Oslo by the Nobel Committee, but it's misplaced to think that the Prime Minister of Norway can decide who gets that prize. It's difficult to conduct diplomacy that way for European leaders. It's very unpredictable. It's confusing. I don't know what I don't think anyone has really cracked the code of how to respond to these kinds of unconventional statements from Donald Trump.
Mm-hmm.
So that continues to be that's going to continue to be a challenge for the rest of his term.
Well, we'll have to leave it there for today. Matt Steinglass is Europe editor at The Economist. Thank you so much for joining us today and explaining all of this.
Thanks, Amina. Bye.